right, let's go ahead and get started. So it is a tremendous pleasure to introduce Cassandra Davis. She's our speaker for today's Friday seminar. Cassandra is an assistant professor in the Department of Public Policy, and she has a PhD in education from University of Chapel Hill, formerly a student at Wake Forest in sociology and history. And Cassandra has done really interesting research on a number of different topics. The way I got to know her work and what she's going to talk about today involves studying the disruptive effect of hurricanes on K through 12 schools and also on the teachers and students within them. More recently, or as recently, she started a new project looking at the pandemic and its impacts on first generation college students. And I am really going to be fascinated to learn the outcome of that research, which is underway. I know they did a first survey about that, and I think are doing a follow-up. I've gotten to know Cassandra through her work on our project on the dynamics of extreme events on people and places. Cassandra has been just an incredible addition to the project. She's worked with students to analyze qualitative data she first collected after Hurricane Florence, and is working now to extend that by re-interviewing the same informants and adding new ones in new communities. So she's just been a great addition to our project. So it really is a huge pleasure to have her speak with us today. And her talk today is titled Moving from Research to Practice, a reflection on hurricanes, schools, and stakeholders. And we'll hold questions until she finishes up sometime around 12:40, 12:45, and then I'll moderate the discussion. So Cassandra, welcome. Thank you so much for being here, and we're looking really forward to your talk.
Yes, no, thank you so much for having me here. It's kind of funny. I haven't coughed this entire day for the last week, and I just started coughing randomly before this presentation. So please forgive me. I have my water, but let's get started to talk about this. Okay, so my research, I am focused on looking at the environmental disruptions to schooling and that we see within the Southeast. I focus largely on hurricanes, but as you all know, I mean, we're in this virtual space right now because of COVID. So COVID is a massive environmental disruption to schooling. But even before COVID, if we can remember that time, but even before COVID, and looking specifically at hurricanes and looking at fires, we have seasons of fire in the West Coast. Tornadoes, we have them that, unfortunately, we had some recent tornadoes in the area, as well as hitting Alabama and Mississippi yesterday and a couple days ago. Very relevant, very real pieces, as well as COVID. But kind of even with all of that information that we know about schools after a disaster and kind of that preparation during a disaster, we really have limited information that focuses specifically on kind of the long-term academic outcomes, the behavior outcomes, as well as that social emotional impact that we see on both students and educators. So today I'm going to quickly talk about my perspective, my positionality, my research, and then I'm going to focus specifically on a study where I looked at the impacts of hurricanes Harvey that hit Texas in 2017 and Matthew that hit North Carolina in 2016. I'm also going to talk about the ways in which that I engaged with stakeholders, and then have a summary, connections, next steps at the end. And absolutely, please send or ask your questions at the end, and we can have a great conversation. So as I said earlier, I'm really focused on the environmental disruptions to schooling communities. I define schooling communities as the educators, the students, and their families. I'm interested in looking at accessing or assessing the disruption, figuring out how to improve recovery, as well as how do we engage policy. My methodology of choice, qualitative. I focus on qualitative inquiry, really looking at kind of the sites that I've been working with my past and current studies, these ethnographic approaches where I'm situated in communities for a long period of time, survey methodology, mixed methods, as well as a new piece that I've really gotten interested in is photo voice. Some of the pictures within this presentation are actually pictures that were taken by my former graduate student, Dr. Eldrin Diaz, and so they will be in here to show you some real perspectives of what students and educators faced. Framework. really gravitating towards the participatory action research framework, which I will talk on this probably a lot towards the end of this presentation. Critical race theory, focusing on, the who has the power, who doesn't. I'm really interested in the othered as an othered scholar myself, and also vulnerability theory, and what does that look like for marginalized communities that have been impacted by disasters. So getting to the study, a little bit of the background. FEMA has issued at least 16 disaster declarations following a hurricane or tropical storm in 12 states and 3 territories. Despite the frequency of these disasters, there's little to no comprehensive understanding of the effects of these hurricanes on the academic and non-academic outcomes for vulnerable children and the role they play in schools and disaster recovery. There's some excellent research that came out directly after Hurricane Katrina with Cates and her colleagues that found that disasters tend to accelerate pre-existing trajectories within communities. So for example, if a community is doing really well, that disaster will kind of push their environment into a transformative, they will be more economic resilient. Versus if you look at a community that's not doing well, a disaster will then kind of push that community into a non-resilient space. Some of our relevant literature that specifically looks at academic achievement, it's sparse and it's also contradictory, where some hurricane studies show negative effects on achievement, while others show no effect at all. We also see that in other types of disasters show mixed results with negative effects with the impact of earthquakes and then no effects from tornadoes and explosions. We have a nice group of data and research that focuses on the social emotional impact of students. We see that children experience much higher rates of PTS than adults do, but most children eventually return to normal, but some show signs kind of months or even years after an event. Very quickly, a little bit about Hurricane Harvey. I know this probably seems decades ago, but Hurricane Harvey in 2017, property damage about $125 billion. When we look at Hurricane Matthew in 2016, it was about 1.5 billion. Now I don't want, by showing those different numbers, I don't want us to think that there was less of an issue that happened in North Carolina, that the hurricane that hit North Carolina hit places that were largely rural versus Harvey hit Houston, one of the largest cities in our nation. So the difference in property damage is definitely, there's a large difference. So the research questions, we were interested in areas affected by Harvey and Matthew in 20 school districts across Texas and North Carolina. Our following 2 research questions were, what are the major disruptions for schools after a hurricane? And what practices can schools use to assist with recovery? Excuse me. So this is an image of our sample North Carolina sites. And then as well, you can see the sites there are highlighted in green in Texas. A little bit about where we went, that you can see that there are more schools within a district in North Carolina, that there's slightly bit more students that identified as being on free and reduced lunch. So that is a Title I school, which is a school that is serving largely low-income communities. And as I said earlier, we had all 10 of our districts in North Carolina were identified as rural districts, where that was a little bit more spread out within Texas. Our data collection for both North Carolina and Texas, we collected or conducted about 115 interviews where we spoke with school administrators, principals at the elementary, middle, and high school levels. We also interviewed district personnel, so superintendent level positions, and then we also interviewed individuals at the state level. Specifically in North Carolina, we administered a survey that went out to educators across the 10 districts, and we asked them kind of retrospectively, you know, how were things and how are they now, the extent that recovery has happened. So findings. The top themes in the findings are the ones that you see on the screen, but for the purpose of this presentation, I don't have all day to talk about this amazing research. Instead, I'm just going to hit or just describe the top 3. So moving into disruption and displacement. Before the storm, our educators spoke a lot about how it's very easy to go pick up a student. You would drive to their home, pick them up, and bring them to school. After the storm, we found that the disruption just in transportation alone, when transportation meant that schools had to identify where students were located across the district. In some instances, they were outside of the state, they're outside of the district. In other instances, they were outside of the state. So schools had to figure out where students were, and then they had to provide the best route for buses to get the students. And oftentimes, the placement of students change on a daily basis. Just the process of picking up and dropping off students became a massive disruption. Another one focused on operational disruptions, where they found that their tools, their classroom supplies, food, and in some cases, their schools were completely destroyed. We asked, this is through that survey that went out to North Carolina educators, so how much damage did Hurricane Matthew cause to your these different areas, and is specifically focusing on those areas that were impacted, had an extreme damage from Hurricane Matthew. We found that food supplies, the property grounds, and facilities were about a third of the responses said that we saw major damage to these areas. Here's a quote from a principal saying, "They lost everything in the room." That's pretty emotional. I'm sure you heard of, or you know that teachers spend thousands of dollars on their classroom every year. That includes personal stuff as well as what's been purchased. But by the school and the district, there's no resources. So in addition to that, talking about kind of the personal disruptions, another principal quoted, "It was difficult for many of them. Many of them were in temporary housing for months. Many of them were living without electricity because there was just the infrastructure damage. Many of them were living with tarps on their homes." And so respondents talked a lot about how their homes were damaged, how they lost clothes, toiletries, foods, and even loss of their pets. This is a picture that was taken, that was put on a school. Now, if you can imagine for 1 second, these schools, some of these schools have a historical significance within their communities, especially the schools that were within communities of color. That these schools represented places that their children went to, they themselves attended, their parents went to, and their grandparents had gone to. And so kind of trying to find that normalcy and returning back to a place that has been consistent for generations, and to find the sign of being unsafe on it really created an emotional toll on our parents and our families and our students that we just did not even think to or didn't expect. So we also asked in our survey kind of the moderate to severe impact of Hurricane Matthew, and we had them talk about themselves, their colleagues, as well as their students. When responding for themselves, they said that yes, it was the Hurricane Matthew severely impacted their ability to attend work. A little bit less of about a third their personal residence, a quarter their access to food, and a little over a quarter access to supplies. Now, when they spoke about their colleagues, it's over half impacted their personal residence as well as their attendance to work. About half their access to food as well as their access to supplies. We also saw that when they talked about their students, that this was a majority of their personal residence, of their ability to attend school, of their ability to have access to food, as well as access to supplies. A third are suggesting that the students also suffered from a personal loss as well as physical health. So some lessons learned for the disruption, really thinking about of a practitioner perspective from the lessons learned of having these massive disruptions, returning to a familiar routine quickly. Administrators really talked and really pushed of establishing a routine, and it also provides a sense of normalcy for their students as well as their staff. In addition to that, teachers and school personnel talked about accepting aid, and it requires vulnerability. They really were interested or needed to see that their leaders were also impacted by this terrible devastation. They needed to see a little bit more human side. So just really our our recommendation would be to be open about personal experiences and creating an environment where individuals are comfortable talking about school and district needs. Mental health. As I said earlier, there's a great bit of research that talks about the mental health and the social emotional impact that we find on students after disaster. What we don't see is research and articles that focus on the social emotional impact of our educators. That was very apparent within the study and other studies that have followed this one, where individuals, both from the student perspective and educator perspective about students, so their perspective and their perspective of their students' perspective, they talked about weather-related anxiety. So what is this? Even months after the storm, a teacher would talk about how it would rain in their class and that their students would think, oh my goodness, it's coming again. And they would have to completely regroup, stop the lessons and adjust. And also a bit of responses about survivor's guilt. So this piece where your community is down, but your house is okay. So you feel guilty about that. We had expected people to talk about exhaustion and being depressed, also suffering from PTS. But the weather-related anxiety and survivor's guilt was definitely a surprise. Additionally, we had some instances of self-harm. So again, we asked a question in the survey, kind of the severe impact of Hurricane Matthew on mental health. For myself, educators felt that they, about 27% felt like they had there was a severe impact. They also suggested that about half of their colleagues faced this, and also more than half of their students that Hurricane Matthew had a severe impact on their mental health. Now we wanted to ask a question about, or we asked a question about the success at assisting students with mental health. Now overwhelmingly, we're seeing that about 75%, 3/4 of the surveyed educators said that believe to have success in assisting their students. But we also see that about 1/4 did not. Later at the bottom of this presentation, I include a slide from a study that I just finished, where we went back and we asked educators 3 years after, 4 years after Hurricane Matthew, do you still feel like people have recovered? And I'll get to that. So also something that came up in our results, a continuation of stress. We talked about how the disaster happened, and there's obviously the immediate stressors. But what happens is are these lingering stressors, that once the rivers are, the river is down, the water is gone, everything is dry, there's still these lingering stresses that are situated within schools, that are as evident from the educators and from their students months to even years after the disaster, after the natural hazard. And so this is a quote from a principal. Okay. So lessons learned from mental health, providing counseling services. We saw that some places that did receive counseling services might have really upped it within a couple weeks, 2 weeks after the disaster, which is great. But what was really needed, that educators and respondents said that they needed that support for long term. Also being responsive to the needs of students and staff. So establishing short and long-term supports following the storm. And the last theme that I'm going to discuss today is talking about supporting staff. So within our survey, we asked educators, again, this survey was just for North Carolina educators, we asked them what supports were available, were most helpful, and as well as were missing. So this table kind of provides that summary where we asked the educators what supports were provided to students and school personnel following Hurricane Matthew. Something that you can see very quickly is that the adjustment to school calendar, that students received this adjustment, 86% of responses said that yes. And then about 75% of responses came from personnel that said yes, that they received this adjustment. But what's really interesting is, and I apologize that these lines are a little off, but hopefully the colors will get you to what I'm talking about. If you look at the items that are in red, that shows that there's a large difference between the supports that were provided to students versus those that were provided to the personnel. we saw that, students, potentially a little bit more than half of the students were able to take home supplies, as well as able to have access to school supplies. But if you look at the personnel, they said that less than 10% were able to take home kind of personal supplies. So personal supplies, I mean toiletries, toilet paper, things that you would need at home, and then the school supplies as well. Also, we saw a very large difference between, looking at the shelters for personal use, when you look at the students, as well as kind of the shelters for personal use that are provided to the personnel, and transportation. Now, there's this idea that when a disaster or a natural hazard, an event occurs, it impacts everybody. No one is kind of safe. That's true and false, right? But in this instance, focusing on the districts that were being served, it makes sense that students were receiving services and resources, but really showing and highlighting the disparities and the ways in which that personnel also needed and received services as well. So another question where we looked at the most beneficial supports. And we asked them the most beneficial for students as well as most beneficial for school personnel. So just focusing on the school personnel, they talked about the adjustment to school calendar was most beneficial. And then also having a space, that shelters for school to relocate or shelters for personal use. And lastly, what was missing? What, if any, supports for students and school personnel were missing? Again, kind of focusing just on school personnel here, they talked about resources and supplies absolutely missing. So that could be financial support, that could be free meals at the school, that could be things to take home, mental health care providers, as well as school supplies. So these are the varying ways that staff felt supported. They felt supported by having these open, they call them PLCs, performance learning centers, goodness gracious, I'm getting all my education acronyms confused. But these are spaces where educators can come together and collaborate and talk about different things that are needed within their cohort or in their area. Also time. When an educator could go and address a leader within their school and say, hey, I need time to help build or put back my house or help my family member. Also, payday, something that was a little bit surprising to us. We found that in some instances, districts stopped paying their employees when they were out of school. So a great way to feel supported is to continue to being paid, even if individuals are not physically in the school building. So lessons learned, encourage collaboration. And also be flexible with time and payments. Allow educators the ability to take time off to deal with personal disruptions, but also pay your people. Ensure your staff are paid. So engaging stakeholders. This is kind of part of my favorite process of doing this. Before I jump into a research project or study, more within these last kind of 5 years, I really want to meet up with the different stakeholders and ask questions. Is this a thing? And especially for this project, I did just that, where I went to all of the different people, and actually all of these representatives that you see in this image. I went to all of these different offices. I had a number of meetings, and I said, hey, I see that we have North Carolina gets hit by a tropical storm at least every other year since the mid-1800s. So surely, is there something that is helping kind of the academic, the other outcomes, the social emotional pieces for students at the end? And the question was, we don't have that. And this is no way shaming the process in North Carolina, but I found that a lot of places, a majority of our areas that we've worked with before also said the same thing. So this really created a fantastic opportunity to work with these different members and to really think of how we can conduct research that will then directly benefit our communities and the communities that we serve. So as kind of the normal procedure in the academic space, we push out papers that focus on our results from our research. We are also I was also invited to a number of places based on those kind of relationships that I started with the different agencies, and I presented my results where we talked about future policy or future discussions of what does this look like, and how we can help improve the needs of our students. I was invited to FEMA and the U.S. Department of Education. They have a newly funded group that just focuses on disasters in schools. NSF, where I was invited to talk about the present and future of disasters, and the North Carolina State Climate Office. But from that, even kind of before we got to that place, and something that I do now for my research is that it's, going back to participatory action research, it is vital, it is imperative, it is something that it's my foundation, that if I'm going to do research, if I'm going to be working with communities and educators and relevant stakeholders, that they get the information first. So we decided that we were going to create these 2 products out of that study, and we wanted to send them straight back to our communities. So the product on the left is a 2-pager front back, and the product on your right screen is a 1-pager front back. We wanted to make sure it was concise and that they could reference this information and see, oh goodness, like we're seeing that our students are receiving these supports, but we're seeing that we're missing this from our personnel. These are ways that we can kind of further engage or further help out our different areas within our schools. Shameless plug, on my website on CassandraRDavis.com, I typically upload all of our kind of polished and finalized products that are free for distribution, so that when a school district is looking for some information, that they can easily hopefully easily go to my website and pull down these different reports that are available. You'll find that from our last NSF grant, that there are additional products on there that focus strictly on student outcomes, that focused on behavior and social emotional as well as school recovery. So with those 2 products, I received a small grant from the Center of Public Service, Carolina Center for Public Service, and I worked with a group of undergrad students who identified every single district in our Southeast that had been impacted by a hurricane in the last 3 years. Turns out there's 502 of them across these 8 states. And so we sent both of these products with a nice little letter of saying, yeah, tough times, we're here. We have some research that will hopefully help out this process. We sent it out to every single superintendent across the 502 school districts. In addition to that, we hosted a webinar with my co-PI, Sarah Fuller, who's also a professor in public policy, the Department of Public Policy. And in this webinar, we had a great conversation and connection with different educators in the Southeast that talked specifically about what does recovery look like? How can we truly talk about recovery when our coasts are hit constantly? So that was something else that we put out there for the community. So here are some of my personal lessons that I've learned in the very short time that I've been doing, just kidding. Again, focusing back on ensuring that my research is situated and infused in making sure that the communities that I'm working with, that it is a reciprocal relationship. Unfortunately, higher ed institutions, research firms, research consultants, we have a terrible reputation in terms of working with communities, and I'm talking about socially marginalized communities of color and low-income communities. The reputation is that we go in and we take and then we leave. It's very violent. I myself have been on projects that have done just that. And I have, decided that that's not the direction that I would like to continue doing. That's not me kind of pushing you to do such things, but it was just my personal conviction. So my recommendations whenever working with communities in the future is really identifying those gatekeepers. Those people are key. Those are the people that will get you. You can be in the community and not be in the community at all. Those are the people that have the that can give you access to data, to information, for qualitative perspectives. They can give you access to other respondents, the people who you would likely miss if you just drove through. I also overly communicate my findings. I find that a main complaint that I hear from community members is that people who take and they don't report back. And so I want to make sure that I am unknowing with my reporting of the findings. If you don't get it in a product, a policy brief, if you don't get it in a personal presentation where I will give you a highlight of summaries, or an email, or even a phone call, you are going to be annoyed at how much, hopefully not, hopefully you'll want to continue to with me, like that's also the purpose, but being very purposeful and overly communicating with community members. Also, situate yourself as an advocate. Now, I preface that you cannot do this haphazardly. And if that's not the position you want to take, do not take it, because that's also violent. But really showing that I am here to advocate, I'm here to be in that lane or that space that you have decided for me. And validation also helps. Getting that validation from that seasoned member within the community will help you get access and doors open in other places. Some personal lessons that I've learned from working with state and federal agencies is using multiple sites and or stakeholders. Our state and federal agents are in so many, have so many different responsibilities. And sometimes I find that if I am communicating with these different pots, it's definitely useful. So I would suggest in using multiple individuals. Also, concise is always best. As a qual person, I love words, I love to read, but I recognize that not everybody loves that. So really kind of sticking my products and ensuring that the products are one pages or 2 pages, nothing more. Unless they want all the words, then I typically will give both. And also situate yourself as an asset. You know, showing that you are here to be a supportive agent versus, you know, showing that I am an expert in this area and you need to listen to me. I find that I get more access to identifying myself as an asset versus this scholarly expert. I mean, to be fair, they would know that I'm an expert in this area. That's why I'm in the room. So sometimes I find that it's best to just situate yourself as an asset. And then validation here also helps. Hopefully that wasn't too many of my personal lessons. But in summary, some policy implications that I pulled, that my team and I, that we pulled together from working on just this Hurricane Matthew and Harvey study. You know, providing counseling services, you know, to your staff and to your students. Make appropriate services available, especially those that have weather-related anxiety. If, as an educator or an administrator, you're aware that we're going to have a terrible rainstorm in the next couple of days, how do you then situate conversations, curriculum, spaces so that students and educators can just get a break, or be able to have a space that if they're starting to feel anxious, that they're able to go to? You know, be responsible to the needs of students and staff. I was a former classroom teacher, so obviously I'm pushing the and staff pretty hard here. You want to establish short and long-term supports following a storm, as well as encourage collaboration. Leaders could inspire different levels of staff to work together. So that's just not the teachers to the people who are leading the teachers. That's the lunch manor woman. That's the person who is helping out with the custodial duties within the school. That is the administrative assistant who helps in with check-in. That's everybody. It is a school community, and bringing people together to encourage some collaboration. And finally, be flexible with time and with payments. Allow educators the ability to take time off and deal with personal disruptions, and ensure all staff are paid even during the recovery period. So this was a figure that I mentioned earlier in the presentation, where this is from my, my study that just wrapped up, where we were looking at the impact of Hurricanes Matthew and Florence, and seeing if districts, particularly in North Carolina, if they recovered any differently from either kind of being hit repeatedly by a storm versus those who were hit singularly. And so that we found, when we asked, you know, what's your perceptions of student recovery after Matthew in 2019, we had those that were largely hit by Hurricane Matthew, in Matthew in 2016, that 9% said no. So majority, 91% said yes, our students have recovered. When we look at the schools that were hit by both equally, Florence and Matthew, about 3/4 said yes. And when we look at schools that were largely hit by Florence, 46%, almost half, said no. So this is just a good thing to think about in terms of kind of the future, especially when we know from data from NOAA, data from all of the different places, from the Natural Hazard Center out of Boulder, Colorado, that we know that these storms will increase in frequency and in intensity. So really kind of continuing the conversation of what does recovery look like? And I would be remiss if I left out COVID-19. Just adding this quick slide where really hitting back on the social emotional impact. The similar findings that we found with hurricanes and with COVID-19 is really understanding this continuation of stress with immediate and lingering stressors. Major difference, a hurricane happens and a couple of days later or a day later, it's gone, right? Or a few hours, it's gone. In a matter of a couple of weeks, the area is somewhat back to normal. But that there's lingering stressors for long periods of time, even after that very short event. In this case, we are in this year-plus long hurricane that is still going on. And so it's wondering how long of a recovery time that this will be for populations, especially those populations of greatest need. The mental health ripple effects, it affects on academics. We see that it affects on your behavior. We also see that it affects your attendance. And really what was missing, we find that mental health providers was a huge thing that was missing. So again, with the lessons learned from educators, providing counseling services, and we're being responsible to the needs of students and the educators. Okay, so that is the end of my presentation. I am just very thankful and honored that I got the opportunity to present my findings from the study where we investigated the impact of Hurricanes Harvey and Matthew in Texas and North Carolina. And so I'm sure some of you all have questions about the process and the study.
Cassandra, thank you. Go ahead.
Nope, last thing I must do. I just want to thank NSF for supporting the research. I also want to thank all of the district and school personnel from regions impacted by Hurricanes Florence, Harvey, Matthew. The list of hurricanes kind of continue. And just thank you for those educators who gave up their time to be so responsive to our surveys as well as to our interviews. So I'm now done.
Well, that was fantastic. Thank you so much. There are questions coming into the Q&A and also the some names in the chat. So let me start by reading A. Taylor's question. Why do you think survey respondents consistently felt that the effects, both physical and mental, on colleagues were higher than on themselves?
This is a question I get all the time. Great question. And it's the same thing of like, you know, I feel like that there needs to be a bit more work in this area. And I am familiar that there are other spaces that talk about, especially mental health, how I view it from myself versus how I may view how it's impacting my colleagues. Like, I'm okay, but my colleagues are a mess, right? I'm wondering, my perception would be that it would probably be a bit higher for themselves and potentially a bit lower for their colleagues. So it's probably somewhere in between. But I mean, absolutely, that also came across in the one, sorry if I'm gonna make anyone dizzy here, but it also came across in the question, this question, where we looked at the impact on yourself, your colleagues, as well as your students. So great question. The response is additional digging up to understand what's happening.
Great, thanks. Barbara Entwistle, I think, has got a question as well. And Barbara, do you want to ask?
Sure, thank you. Hi, Cassandra. I really enjoyed your presentation. Thank you. And you may have addressed this, and I must have missed it. That's always a possibility. But I'm curious about the difference between public schools and private schools. It seemed to me that a lot of your talk here was about the public schools when you're communicating with superintendents and so forth. And I just would be interested to hear some reflection. Certainly the way that publics and privates dealt with COVID was very different. I don't know how they deal with hurricanes, so I just would be guessing there. But I wondered what you would have to, how much of this applies to them too.
Oh, great question. That's absolutely an area that we wanted to receive more funding to go into, and not just the private schools, but also the charter schools. But I would, and exactly what you said, Barbara, that we see the difference, the clear difference in COVID. I would imagine that we would see similar differences in terms of responses, access to resources. I mean, really, that one question when we're asking personnel as well as their students, who's kind of getting the resources. I would imagine that personnel or educators within private schools, they have better access to resources. They probably, that would be an assumption. But I think with more exploration would be vital. What's really interesting, especially with the charter school movement that has continued on in North Carolina, and how different charter schools look like in our state from each other. I think it would be really interesting in going in and seeing how they're tackling it. Are their responses similar to those of private school or similar to those of public school? So yes, and you are correct in saying that our results were strictly from public schools.
Thanks. So a question in the Q&A from Deshira Wallace. Were you able to learn about the impact of ongoing occupational environmental issues in buildings, such as needing to manage home-based or school-based threats like mold or other environmental agents?
So we did not tackle the school-based threats like mold. That is where I think it is absolutely vital, especially in talking about kind of these physical disruptions. I was more focused on kind of the social, how this impacted or how, that picture that I had of the parents walking and seeing that sign, how did that emotionally disturb or upset educators and students, more importantly, students and their families. I will say that there is a group of research that's works with engineers as well as sociologists, where they're focused when they talk about school impact on storms. They're largely focused on mold. They're largely focused on the infrastructure of the physical building. And so where my research is new in this space is that we're looking at the kind of the unseen pieces. So to answer your question, I did not focus on those threats like mold. It's absolutely vital, but that was not a part of the study.
Great, thanks. And then I think Ihioma Iruka has a question. Do you want to ask your question?
I would love to.
Great.
Thank you so much, Cassandra, for your insightful research. And so I'm an early childhood researcher, as you know, and I want to kind of hear your take on what do you think, if you see anything in your data and your research regarding sort of the age of children and the potential long-term consequences. Again, I love the focus on really the psychosocial and the social emotional health of children, and whether you're seeing anything regarding how these sort of disasters, including COVID-19, sort of the continued detrimental impact for children, especially younger age children, if you have any insights in that.
All these are great questions. So with the study where we looked at, so we did target and we interviewed principals at elementary school levels. So the lowest level that we went to was kindergarten through 5th grade. In terms of how younger children, well, the research suggests that younger children bounce back much faster than older children. It is a, no, I mean, I would imagine that, I would imagine, especially given what the research says, that we would see that, but then I would also question, well, how does that fare in our low-income in our communities of color. And I would also question, what does bounce back mean, right? I'm in this space of, well, what does recovery mean? Like if I'm in a community that is constantly being hit by storms, and I constantly have to deal with mold, like part of that last question, or I constantly have to think of these health pieces that I'm feeling, and my teacher turnover rate is so high. What am I, in a storm, an event happens, what am I bouncing back to if this is a cycle that's happening in my community? So I think a couple things that are coming out from your question is that I'm myself of kind of wrestling with the term vulnerability. I'm wrestling with the term of recovery, and for who gets access to recover, and also with your point about looking at our younger children. Like I said, the research says that younger children bounce back fairly faster than older children. But to what extent, what does bounce back mean? And my assumption would be that would look different across groups.
Great, thanks, Cassandra. I have a question which is a little bit like that, but I'm wondering if you saw in your respondents any differences in the ways that storms sort of affected the roles that educators are playing, depending on whether the educator was male or female. Do they sort of respond differently in terms of how they reach out and try to help their students?
So we didn't look at the differences based on gender in terms of responses. I can say that we did see, and I'm probably meshing two studies together, we did see that there were instances where a school would say, hey, our students are out, let's create these yoga spots. And so they would have these pop-up yoga spaces for students and families to come to and practice mindfulness routines and exercises for an hour or so, and then kind of go away. So there was another instance. This is definitely from after Hurricane Florence within North Carolina, where pockets of educators would create these, something that we're seeing with COVID-19, that they would create these spaces where families and students could come and pick up their work packet, and it gave them a time to kind of communicate, to say, hey, do you need anything else? We have extra supplies right here. So I think an extra step on this would be to assess the extent that these type of pop-up strategies for the educators and students, how successful. For example, like particularly for the schools that practice kind of mindfulness activities during a natural event, did those students, after the event ended, did those students, were their attendance rates higher than their colleagues or the other schools that did not? For the students in North Carolina who were able to kind of continually build that community and see their educators from multiple times a week to a daily basis, do we see that their achievement scores, if that's something that we're trying to measure, or do we see that their behavior rates were lower? So I absolutely agree with the question and the route that you're thinking, that I think another level would be to assess what type of supports are we seeing the best outcomes for, and are meeting the needs of their students and families, and then are providing this kind of reciprocal relationship, community bonding, and ultimately helping the students, right?
Yeah, great, thanks. Okay, I think there's a question from Nikhil who is gonna ask his question.
Yeah, thank you, Elizabeth. Thanks, Cassandra, for the presentation. And I just wanted to say I appreciate you discussing kind of like some of your research ethics and principles, and in terms of how you work with community and communication. I know it's something that we're discussing a lot with environmental science work and environmental justice and CBPR. So thank you for that. And I wanted to ask you, as somebody who also used to work in a school, kind of if you've been able to follow up to see have there been any policy changes around resources provided to staff and kind of how they're considered? Even like thinking about professors at UNC, I know last year I was TAing, and students were having a lot of, asking for extensions and having, familial difficulties during COVID. And there was one lecture where the professor stopped and kind of presented about how everything going on in the world, including like the Black Lives Matter protests and things, were impacting them too. And I found it fascinating, like perhaps the students weren't even considering that the professors at the same time as teaching were living in the same craziness of the world that we were into. So I think that's sometimes like forgotten, that educators provide mental health support, therapy, and so many other resources for the students. So
no, I mean, absolutely, all of that, absolutely. I will say that yes, we did a follow-up study after Florence. So the survey went out in 2019. You saw that one figure where we asked follow-up questions. We asked questions about the extent that their policies had changed or their behaviors, you know, they were able to adapt better to a new storm. We found that in some places people did, but in other places they did not. And I will say, again, as the educator, I am defending my educators, that I feel like there is an absolute, I love these interdisciplinary spaces. I'm an advocate for them. I think that they are vital, especially if we're trying to push and move the needle. But what I'm finding in my conversations with emergency and education spaces, that both are saying the same thing, and they're both ultimately wanting the communities to recover and to like be better and stronger after of an event. But the process to get there is different on both sides. A very quick example can be, I was having conversations with an agency, and they really wanted to push out having a talk about preparedness of hurricanes, because hurricane season is coming up. And hurricane season is June 1. I believe there's talks to move it to May, but June 1, we'll say it was June 1. And my pushback was, that's testing time. You can say everything that you want. It's not gonna reach the ears or the eyes of anyone in school, because the focus is testing. So I find that timelines are different. And I find that conversations are in any space are different. But to your point about the professor experiencing, you know, that forgetting that professor was also situated in we're all in the pandemic. And a personal example for myself is that over my a very close family member of mine, we are 6 months apart. He had COVID-19, and he was in the hospital. And there was a moment when we talked, and we thought he wasn't going to make it. It was a very real, surreal moment, and very difficult moment. But then the very next day, I had to teach class, right? I've known colleagues who have lost people, unfortunately, who have related to COVID, not related to COVID, who have had to deal with holding up their own households or their family households because of the sheer massive disruption that COVID has caused on a financial perspective, but still coming in and making sure that they're providing hopefully the best lessons and the best curriculums for their students. And I get it. As someone who was in the classroom, our priority and responsibility are our students, are the children. But unfortunately, what happens is that us get lost in that process. We started to see from a turnover perspective. I spoke with one superintendent after the study, and he had mentioned that he had about 100, a teacher turnover of 100 teachers. And this is a small rural district that can't afford to lose 5 teachers, let alone 100. And so it's out there. That these things of continuing to push forward without really stopping and pausing and getting a pulse check of oneself, we get lost, and then a lot of people get left behind.
Thank you. So I'm going to read a question that came in on the Q&A from Rick Ludick. Has your research attempted to separate short-term recovery, getting back to normal as quickly as possible, from long-term recovery, such as reducing risk to future events? In terms of long-term recovery or risk reduction, do you believe school systems feel empowered to even think about this, or do they rely on others to address this?
Good question. No, I mean, and I don't know if it's empowered. I'm thinking about time, right? Like back to my example about the time of, we need to talk about preparedness for hurricane season that's happening, and you will likely the data suggests we're going to get hit. We're going to get hit again. So logically, it makes sense. We need to start thinking about this, but I don't think that they, and I do not mean to make this into a political stance, but I don't think as educators as a whole, with all of the other responsibilities, that they also have a responsibility in also thinking about preparedness. So my push is that really kind of establishing some bit of an interdisciplinary team of someone that says, or a group, it's partly why I'm creating these products, right? Like, I recognize no time. Here's some research that can hopefully help you or help whomever to make decisions in moving forward. Collectively, I would love to have a center where this type of information is pushed out freely to communities and schools that are in need, but also having these kind of community pods where people can come together and talk about these long-term impacts and how to kind of continue to prepare for the future. I will also say that this was not in my making, right? This is not in my doing, but out of this survey, we had 1,700 educators respond. They had a 2-week window at the end of a school semester, like at the end, the last week of class, the last 2 weeks of class, which is unheard of. The second study that we did, we had over 4,000 educators respond. Same 2-week window, we just included 5 extra districts. People are hungry to talk about this. They recognize that this is an issue, and they recognize, how can we better invest into education and this process to recover, because it's not sustainable by kind of working in education, getting the class and everything ready, and then just coming back next year ready to start the next year. Planning is absolutely necessary, but just trying to figure out and construct a way that it can happen. Hopefully I've answered that question.
Thanks. Great. And then I think one more question from Alexis Dennis.
Hi, Cassandra. Thank you so much for a wonderful talk this afternoon. So I wanted to follow up on the comments that you just made about sustainability, and then also in your response to the comment before about how teachers are dealing with the same crises that their students are dealing with in terms of natural disasters or COVID, but then we're also expected to show up and still do our jobs and come to our jobs with our full self, which can lead to burnout. And the process you described to me seems to speak at larger institutional or structural problems, in that institutions aren't taking care of the people who make them up. And so I'm wondering, based on your research and your findings, what recommendations would you have, or how would you like to see educational institutions change moving forward so that they're able to take care of both the students, but also the teachers as well, in a more sustainable way?
Absolutely. Hope I wasn't coming off too preachy, but
No,
I mean, we're in COVID times, right? Everybody is being impacted by this lovely pandemic right now. And so we're all kind of seeing the weaker areas are being exposed, right? Just kind of going back to it, I think absolutely the piece about having access to counseling services. I'm working on this fantastic project with Stacy Overstreet, who's out of Tulane, and they were able to survey educators before they returned back to school before COVID. And in New Orleans, I don't have the numbers on hand, but I believe they were hit with like 5 hurricanes this past fall. So just thinking about all these extra layers that educators have to think of. And what I'm recalling from that survey, that educators talked about having this extra space. Like, what does this, creating a space where people could go and tap in and say, I'm tapped out, I need support. Either I need support for myself, or I am recognizing that a number of my students need support. So I either need a social, emotional professional to help me with that, or I need a physical space where I can have a moment to do some bit of mental processing. I think that, yes, I think as institutions, and I believe that this can be said about a lot of places, a lot of businesses, a lot of institutions, that we ourselves are, or I will just speak for myself, that I will like to continue to go and grind. And then a month later, I'm passed out on the couch somewhere, right? Just really taking a better look at how this environment is impacting us individually and collectively. So they talked about creating these extra spaces. The educators in this study, and well as other study, also talked about having that immediate supports. So either a person that's physically there, in this case, it would have to be virtually for COVID, or it would be a community of maybe there's a group of not just educators, but the schooling community can come together to create a space where they're like, we're all suffering. You know, how can we, I recognize now that you're suffering, I didn't know that you were. So what are the things that we need to move forward? I think more clarity, more open communication about how it's impacting individuals, and then how to kind of provide them with the necessary supports that they need to move forward. And so that was, I feel like this conversation about social emotional well-being and health is situated in every aspect, in so many different aspects. But I am hopeful that the future, we can really kind of address how it is hitting our educators, so that they can be their best selves when supporting their students during a pandemic, event, flooding, fire, all et al.
Thank you.
All right, well, we are sadly out of time, but that was absolutely great. Thank you so much for coming and for sharing your results and your studies. We really appreciate it. And there's lots of clapping going on. All right, everybody, have a fantastic weekend. Hopefully we're free of hurricanes, tornadoes, and other stuff, but COVID is always with us. Okay, bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye, be safe out there.